I'm Ian Fearon. I'm Director of What If Consulting Limited and Chief Scientific Officer with McKinney Regulatory Science Advisors. What I'm going to talk about in this presentation are medicinal electronic cigarettes or e-cigarettes, and how I believe that providing an electronic cigarette on prescription to help smokers stop smoking is a great unmet public health need, which can really help in the battle against the death and disease caused by combustible cigarette smoking. Four main themes of this presentation. I'm going to talk about the unmet need and how big is that unmet need. I'm going to talk about what is contributing to the problem, what's adding to it. I will then speak about if, from a manufacturer's perspective, if you want to help meet the unmet medical need for an electronic cigarette, how might you go about doing it? And finally, I'll briefly touch on who will benefit from a medicinal e-cigarette and how will they benefit. Before I go through the presentation, first some disclosures. Through What If Consulting and McKinney Regulatory Science Advisors, I provide scientific and regulatory advice and support to e-cigarette manufacturers and also to drug companies. And I'm a scientific advisory board member with Qnovia, a drug company who developed an inhaled nicotine therapeutic for which they're attempting to obtain a medicinal license as a nicotine replacement therapy. Anything I do say in this presentation are my own views and considerations. So what is the unmet need and how big is that unmet need? In the United States, over 28 million people still smoke combustible cigarettes, and in the United Kingdom, 6.4 million people still smoke cigarettes. Around the world, 1.1 billion people are current cigarette smokers. And of course, each and every one of these cigarette smokers is placing themselves at increased risk of heart disease, lung disease, and cancer due to their cigarette smoking habit. The New Approaches Conference, which this presentation was made at in September of this year, lasted for about 11 hours. And in those 11 hours, an astonishing 602 American citizens who were cigarette smokers will have died due to their cigarette smoking habit. Around the world, it's predicted that this century, unless the status quo is changed and we do something to help smokers stop smoking, that 1 billion smokers will lose their lives around the world. So what is contributing to the problem? And what this graph shows is if you gave 100 smokers each of the products listed along the bottom to help them stop smoking and ask them to use it and to stop smoking, how many of them will actually succeed? If you took 100 smokers and asked them to quit but didn't give them any support, approximately 3 of them will be able to stop smoking. And while nicotine gum is twice as effective as quitting cold turkey, it's still not very good and helps approximately 7% of smokers to stop smoking. And even the best therapeutic aid to stopping smoking, varenicline, only helps approximately 1 in 5 smokers to stop smoking. And it's important that you place these data into context of other drugs which are available to treat human disease. Now on the right-hand side are the top 3 prescription drugs in the United States. And if we take the middle one, amoxicillin, which is an antibiotic used to treat lung infections in cigarette smokers, if you gave 100 cigarette smokers with a lung infection amoxicillin, over 90% of them would have that infection cleared up. So when you relate the efficacy of these prescription medicines to licensed medicinal products to help people quit smoking, the medicinal products, the NRT products, just aren't very good. And what's also surprising is that the middle bar that's just appeared, the 38% bar, this is the efficacy of Juul in helping people quit smoking. If you gave 100 smokers a Juul e-cigarette and asked them to stop smoking, data has shown that 38% of them 6 months later will have completely quit smoking. And what this really demonstrates that e-cigarettes are good at helping people quit smoking, and they're potentially way better than the current prescription medicines that are given to smokers each and every day around the world. The other thing that's contributing to the problem is misinformation. Recent data from the ASH survey in the United Kingdom showed that 40% of smokers wrongly believe that using an electronic cigarette is equally or more harmful than cigarette smoking. On the way to the No Approaches conference, I was in Germany, also attending a conference. And leaving the hotel early one Friday morning, I bumped into Siebert, who's a 24-year-old cigarette smoker from Norway. I asked Siebert as he was puffing away on his cigarette whether he'd ever thought about using an electronic cigarette as a less harmful means of getting the nicotine that he craved. And his response was no, e-cigarettes are way, way, way more harmful than cigarette smoking. And it's an anecdote, but it's another example of how people wrongly believe that e-cigarettes are harmful. And this prevents us switching to them and prevents them giving up smoking combustible cigarettes. So why hasn't anybody done anything yet? Why are there no prescription electronic cigarettes currently available to doctors to prescribe? And the reality is that some e-cigarettes or e-cigarette-like products have received prescription licenses in the United Kingdom. So the Voke inhaler, which isn't a classic electronic cigarette, it's a gas-powered nicotine inhaler, and the E-Voke cigar-like electronic cigarette received authorizations from the MHRA about 10 years ago, but neither of them made it to market and neither of them have ever been prescribed by a physician. Companies have tried or are trying in the United States to get a electronic cigarette license as a prescription medicine. Hale Therapeutics have tried, but due to various problems, they've now pivoted into the UK pathway instead. And Qnovia, with their Respirex product, are trying to get medicines approval in the United States as well as in the United Kingdom. But as present, right now, there are no electronic cigarettes currently prescribable by physicians to help smokers stop smoking, despite the fact that they will likely help smokers stop smoking. So if you're a manufacturer and you want to help meet the unmet medical need of a prescription e-cigarette, how might you go about it? And the reality is you can get a prescription license for an e-cigarette pretty much anywhere in the world. But the two countries with the best articulated pathways are the United Kingdom and the United States. And so I'm just going to focus on these two countries. Starting with the United Kingdom, you have to fully characterize the emissions from your electronic cigarette. But your benchmark or your comparator is cigarette smoke. The MHRA is a very pragmatic regulator and understands that the emissions from your e-cigarette should be compared to the thing that cigarette smokers are inhaling each and every day. So therefore you benchmark against cigarette smoke. In the UK, you have to do toxicology studies. You don't need to do animal experiments. You can use a desk-based risk assessment, a computer assessment approach, and support the output from that desk-based risk assessment with in vitro toxicological studies as appropriate. And in terms of clinical trials, you only need to conduct one clinical trial in the United Kingdom, and your efficacy measure is nicotine delivery. And what the MHRA really want to see is that your e-cigarette delivers nicotine to a greater degree than a comparator currently licensed product such as the Nicorette inhalator, but doesn't deliver nicotine to a greater degree than combustible cigarettes. In the United States, you still have to fully characterize the emissions from your electronic cigarette, but your benchmark in the United States is not cigarette smoke, it's fresh air. And this can be problematic. For example, if your e-cigarette heats a solution containing PG and VG, you might generate trace levels of aldehydes. And of course, those trace levels of aldehydes will be greater than the levels of aldehydes in fresh air. And this means that you then have some explaining to do to FDA in order to justify the safety of your e-cigarette product before they will grant you a license. In the US, you do have to do significant numbers of costly and time-consuming animal experiments in numerous species of animals and for time periods of up to 2 years in time. And you have to assess reproductive toxicity, general toxicity, carcinogenicity, etc. in these animal studies. And as I say, these are expensive and these are time-consuming. The efficacy measure in the United States is also very, very different. You still have to do a nicotine delivery study looking at how much nicotine smokers get from your electronic cigarette. But your efficacy measure is not nicotine delivery alone. Your efficacy measure is helping smokers quit. So you'll have to run a smoking cessation trial. And similar to the animal studies, smoking cessation trials are expensive and they're time consuming. And you might have, for example, to recruit 1,000 smokers and follow them up for up to a year to see whether your product has helped them quit smoking or not. If you're designing a medicinal electronic cigarette, what might you need to optimize? Well, you've got to think about abuse liability, nicotine delivery, for example. Does your product deliver enough nicotine that smokers find satisfying? Does it reduce cravings and withdrawal symptoms? Does it deliver too much nicotine so that the regulator won't authorize it? And does it create positive subjective effects? Do smokers find it satisfying? Do they like using it? Are they likely to use it in the future to help them to stop smoking? So you have to think about abuse liability. You have to think about flavors, and these are a good thing in the prescription model. We know that adult smokers like flavors and that they help them stop smoking. And of course, you're not going to create a youth use issue due to the restricted access to prescription electronic cigarettes. You need to think about other ingredients. Each and every ingredient in your e-liquid has to be safe, and you need to demonstrate that to the regulator. And what I tell the companies that I consult for is that simplicity is key. The more compounds and chemicals and ingredients you have in your e-cigarette liquid, the more data you're going to have to generate to demonstrate to the regulator that use of your e-cigarette is safe. And finally, you're going to have to think about delivered dose uniformity. What regulators need assuring is that your product delivers a uniform dose of nicotine regardless of where your product is in its lifetime. So, for example, if your e-cigarette battery is completely full and your e-cigarette battery is half empty, does it still deliver the same amount of nicotine per dose and each time somebody puffs on it? Or when your e-liquid cartridge is full and when your e-liquid cartridge is half empty, does your product still deliver the same dose of nicotine? And so you really have to think about this, and I always encourage manufacturers to do this right at the very start of their design process. Because if you discover that you have a delivered dose uniformity issue after you've conducted your scientific experiments, your toxicology studies or your clinical study, you'll have to redo those experiments once you've tweaked your device to meet the delivered dose uniformity guidelines. What else might you have to think about? Well, you have to think about terminology. And although these are may just seem like words, they define how your product and your company will be treated by the regulator. The nicotine in your electronic cigarette is a drug and must meet drug purity standards. Your e-cigarette is a medical device and must meet medical device standards, and it will be called a nicotine inhaler. You have to think carefully about uniform nicotine delivery, and I talked about this on the previous slide, but you really have to make sure early on in the design process that the delivery of nicotine from your device is uniform and that your product meets delivered dose uniformity standards. You have to think about manufacturing processes and ensure that your manufacturing meets the fairly stringent medical manufacturing standards that regulators require. You need to think about how you're going to get doctors to prescribe your electronic cigarette once it's been authorized, and the medical science liaison people that you're going to get to walk into doctors' offices to convince them to prescribe your electronic cigarette. You need to think about pharmacovigilance, post-market surveillance, and how you're going to assess once your product is marketed that it continues to be safe in the hands of the people that are using it, and to make sure that you have in place a safety reporting system, both for physicians and for the users of your product. You're going to have to think about what to call your product, particularly if your product is already a consumer product, because you can't have a consumer electronic cigarette and a prescription electronic cigarette with the same name. And similarly, you'll have to think about cross-compatibility. If you have, for example, a pod-based electronic cigarette, you can't have a prescription pod which fits into a consumer device and vice versa. So these are just some of the things that you'll have to think about during the lifetime of your medicinal licensing project. You also have to think about the regulator and how you interact with them. In my experience, regulators are armed and highly dangerous, but they do want to help you get to where you want to go, to help you cross the road. But you do have to listen to them, and anything they do say, you should follow their advice as strictly as you can, and they will help you get to where you want to go. So that's phase of the talk, who will benefit from a prescription electronic cigarette and how? And I talked early on about the misperceptions of vaping that exist at the moment, and those misperceptions are growing. And I think, though, that once an electronic cigarette receives a prescription license, that will fix some of the poor messaging that people are hearing about electronic cigarettes and will improve the beliefs among the general public and amongst smokers that vapers are a much less harmful alternative to cigarette smoking and can help them stop smoking. So there will be some kind of halo effect on the whole e-cigarette category once a manufacturer or several manufacturers obtain prescription licenses for e-cigarettes. The company itself will benefit. These data are from Bloomberg, and they predicted that the nicotine replacement therapy market will grow to over $100 billion market globally in the next 5 years or so. That's a huge market. And don't forget that market is one which provides products to smokers which don't actually work. And if your product does work, if it does deliver nicotine and it does help smokers stop smoking, doctors are going to prefer to prescribe your product than the nicotine patches and gums and pharmaceutical products that currently exist. And you will gain a significant proportion of that $100 billion market. And finally, and most importantly in my mind, are the cigarette smokers and their families. Each and every day, thousands of people across the world die due to combustible cigarette smoking. This impacts them and this impacts their families to a huge degree. There are massive benefits to improving the lives of smokers and their families by providing them with better products to help them quit smoking. So just to summarise, in my view, a prescription electronic cigarette is a huge and currently unmet public health need. For any successful manufacturers, there will be a significant financial benefit. The UK licensing pathway is significantly easier to navigate, although there may be lower costs and less time involved in a UK licensing application. This is significantly offset by the smaller market size in the UK compared with the United States. There are many technical and scientific challenges to obtaining a prescription license for an e-cigarette. These challenges are difficult, but they're not insurmountable. And for each and every aspect of your licensing process, you need to seek expert advice, including advice from the agencies, the regulators themselves, such as the FDA and the MHRA. And finally, going fast will slow you down. This is not an easy process, and it's like running with a parachute. The faster you run, the harder it becomes. So you have to be methodical, think about your application, think about what you need to do, and go slowly, and you will get to the end of the licensing process. Thank you for listening. If you do have any questions on anything that I've said in this presentation, please do reach out to me either through What If Consulting or through McKinney Regulatory Science Advisors. We'd love to answer any questions that you have and to support you moving forward if you're interested in obtaining a prescription license for an electronic cigarette.